The morning Beatrice Grayson buried her husband, the stranger on the ridge watched from a distance too polite to be curious and too careful to be innocent. And she knew, without ever having spoken a word to him, that he was carrying something heavier than grief. The year was 1878, and the town of Caldwell Flats, Kansas, sat at the edge of the cattle trail like a tooth knocked loose from a jaw present, but barely holding on. It was a town built on dust and determination, where the saloon opened before the church, and the sheriff kept the peace with one eye open and one hand always near his holster. The prairie stretched out in every direction like a canvas that God had started painting and then abandoned midway, leaving only the golden sweep of grass and the enormous indifferent sky. Beatrice had come to Caldwell Flats 7 years before the morning of the burial, following her husband Edmund Grayson west from Missouri with 2 trunks of household goods, a Bible, and the particular kind of hope that young women carry when they are 22 and believe that the world is something that can be shaped by love alone. Edmund had been a decent man in the way that a fence post is decent solid enough, mostly upright, and entirely unremarkable. He had built her a house at the edge of town, planted a vegetable garden that thrived for 2 summers and then gave up, and had loved her in the quiet, distracted way of a man whose mind was always slightly elsewhere. When he died of a fever in the spring of 1878, Beatrice was 29 years old, the mother of no children, and the owner of a homestead that she had no idea how to keep running alone. She stood at the graveside in black wool that was already too hot for the warming April morning, listening to Reverend Alcott speak words she had heard before at other people's funerals and had never thought to apply to herself. The handful of townspeople who had come stood quietly behind her. She could feel their sympathy like a physical pressure against her back, that uncomfortable mix of genuine sorrow and grateful relief that the tragedy had landed on someone else's doorstep. It was when she lifted her eyes from the freshly turned earth that she saw him on the ridge. He was perhaps a quarter-mile distant, sitting very still on a dun-colored horse, watching the proceedings with his hat in his hand, as though he knew that keeping it on would be disrespectful. Even at that distance, she could see that he was younger than Edmund had been, certainly, and perhaps not a great deal older than herself. He wore trail clothes, dusty and worn, and he carried no visible weapon at his hip, which in 1878 Kansas was either a statement of extraordinary confidence or extraordinary foolishness. When he caught her looking at him, he placed his hat back on his head, turned his horse, and disappeared over the ridge as quietly as a shadow sliding away from the sun. Beatrice said nothing about it to anyone. She had enough to think about. The weeks that followed Edmund's death were full of the mechanical cruelty of practical matters. There were debts to be reckoned, not catastrophic, but real, and the homestead required constant attention that she had always assumed was Edmund's work and now understood had been his only real contribution to their life together. She learned quickly. She had always been quick. Her mother had said more than once that Beatrice had a mind like a steel trap, which was a compliment wrapped in the mildly disapproving suggestion that steel traps were not considered becoming in a woman. She fixed the fence where it had sagged along the eastern pasture. She negotiated, carefully and with more confidence than she felt, with the 2 ranch hands Edmund had occasionally hired, and managed to retain one of them, an older man named Cobb who had bad knees and a reliable conscience, for a fair weekly wage. She planted the garden herself and found that she had a gift for it that Edmund had lacked. She took in mending from the wives on the prosperous side of town and sold preserves at the general store. She was not comfortable, but she was not drowning, and in the West of 1878, not drowning was its own kind of victory. It was 3 weeks after the funeral when she found the stranger on her porch. He was sitting on the top step with his back against the post and his long legs stretched down, and he was holding his hat in his hands the same way he had held it at the graveside, with a kind of careful deliberateness that suggested the gesture meant something to him. He looked up when she came around the corner of the house with a basket of fresh-cut vegetables from the garden, and he stood immediately, which she noted with a mixture of surprise and appreciation, because not every man remembered to stand in 1878. He was taller than she had judged from the ridge, broad-shouldered in the way of someone who had spent years doing physical work rather than the gym-built broadness of affectation. His face was angular and sun-browned, with dark eyes that held a quality she could not immediately name, not sadness exactly, and not guilt, but something that combined the two the way a creek combines its tributaries. He was perhaps 30, 31 at the outside, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has prepared a speech and knows it is already inadequate. "Mrs. Grayson," he said. His voice was low and careful, a voice that had learned to measure itself. "My name is Andrew Maddox. I knew your husband." "I know who you are," she said, though she did not exactly. She set her basket down on the porch railing and studied him. "You were on the ridge." Something shifted in his face. He had not expected that. "Yes," he said. "You did not come to pay your respects." "No," he turned his hat in his hands. "I could not. I did not think it was my place." "Then what is your place now?" she asked. She meant it as a genuine question, not a challenge, and she thought he understood that, because he exhaled slowly and looked out at the flat Kansas horizon before answering. "I owe your husband a debt that I cannot pay him," he said. "So I thought maybe I could pay some of it to the people he left behind." Beatrice looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was doing something extraordinary with the prairie grass beyond the fence line, turning it copper and gold, and Andrew Maddox stood in the middle of all that light looking like a man who had traveled a very long way to say something that still did not quite say everything. "You had better come inside," she said. "I will make coffee." She did not ask him to explain right away. That was not her way. She made the coffee with the slow, deliberate attention she gave to most things and set 2 cups on the table and sat across from him and waited while he decided how to begin. He had ridden with Edmund. That was the beginning of it. Not in the way that respectable men rode together, not as partners in the cattle business or as neighbors on the same trail. They had ridden together in the last years before Edmund had settled in Caldwell Flats, in the years when Edmund was something other than the quiet, slightly distracted homesteader that Beatrice had married. Andrew told her carefully, watching her face with those dark eyes, as though measuring how much truth she could hold before it overflowed. Edmund had run with a crew that moved cattle in ways that the law did not sanction. Not violently. Edmund had never been a violent man, and Andrew made that clear, but dishonestly, and in ways that had brought other men's grief. Andrew had been young and stupid and broke, and the work had paid, and he was not going to make himself sound better than he was. When things had gone sideways on a job in southern Kansas, it was Edmund who had taken the blame. Not out of nobility, Andrew said, with a painful honesty that Beatrice found she respected enormously, but because Edmund had already made a deal with someone to reduce his own sentence if he cooperated, and the cooperation had required offering up a name. Only he had offered up a different name than his own. He had given the sheriff a name that was not quite Andrew Maddox's name, close enough to mislead, different enough to confuse. And in the confusion, Andrew had slipped away west, and Edmund had served a short time and come back and built his life with Beatrice and the vegetable garden and the homestead, and Andrew had carried the knowledge of what had happened like a coal in his chest for years. "He told you this?" Beatrice said when Andrew paused. "No." Andrew wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I worked it out. I was young but not stupid, and I heard things, and eventually I understood what he had done and why, and it was not entirely a sacrifice because he benefited from it too. But he had also genuinely protected me, even if by accident, and the debt was real." Beatrice was quiet for a very long time. Outside the window the Kansas evening was turning the sky extraordinary colors, and she could hear Cobb finishing up in the barn, the familiar sounds of the end of a working day. She thought about Edmund. She thought about the man she had known, decent, quiet, unremarkable. She thought about the man she had apparently not known, or only partially known, the way you sometimes read a book and realize you have been skimming without understanding and have to go back to the beginning. "He never told me," she said finally. "No," Andrew said. "I would not have expected him to." "What did you do after, when you went west?" He told her that too, because she had asked and she deserved an honest answer. He had found legitimate work eventually, not easily, because a man without references and with a vague past is not a trusted commodity in any employer's ledger, but eventually. He had worked cattle drives along the Kishom Trail for 3 seasons, learned the trade from the inside out, and by 1875 had saved enough to buy a small stake in a cattle operation in Texas. It had grown slowly, the way honest work tends to grow. He had come back north when he heard, through the diffuse and unreliable network of trail gossip and transient acquaintance, that Edmund Grayson of Caldwell Flats, Kansas, had died in the spring. "And what is it you think you owe?" Beatrice asked. She kept her voice even. It was a genuine question. "Whatever you need," he said. "Whatever the place needs, I can work. I know cattle, I know land, I know fencing and irrigation. I'm not asking to be paid." He paused. "Though I am also not asking for charity in the sense of imposing myself. If you have no need of help, I will leave and you will never see me again." Beatrice looked at him across the kitchen table. She had the feeling, strong and peculiar and not entirely comfortable, that she was looking at something real for the first time in a while. Not good or bad, just real. The way the prairie is real when you stand in the middle of it without the softening frame of a window. "I have plenty of need of help," she said, "but I will not take it as charity. You can work for wages the same as Cobb. You do not need to, Mr. Maddox." Her voice was gentle but entirely firm. "I am a 39-year-old widow, no, 29. I am 29 with a homestead that needs attention. I am offering you honest work for honest pay. That is not charity. That is commerce. If you are too proud for it, tell me now." He looked at her for a moment with something new in his face, something that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it had not quite arrived yet. "No," he said, "I am not too proud for it." He stayed. He slept in the barn the first week because he insisted, and she let him because she understood that a man who had been carrying a debt for 7 years needed to begin its repayment in a form that made sense to him. By the second week, she had cleared the small room off the kitchen that had served as Edmund's study, and told Andrew he was to sleep there, because the nights in April in Kansas were still cold enough to be unkind, and the barn was not a place for a working man to sleep when there was a room available. He had protested. She had told him that she was not running a charitable organization for proud men, and he had laughed, actually laughed, and it was a good sound, low and genuine, the laugh of someone who found things funny with his whole self rather than just his face. He worked in the way that a man works when he cares about what he is doing. Not frantically, not with the performance of industry, but steadily and intelligently, with attention to the work itself. He repaired the fence along the eastern pasture properly, not just the sagging sections but the whole line, understanding without being told that a fence is either a fence or it is not. He identified the drainage problem that had been killing the northwest corner of the vegetable garden, and fixed it with 2 days of patient digging, and the rerouting of a small irrigation channel that Beatrice had not known existed beneath the hardpan. He talked to Cobb with the straightforward respect of a man who understands the value of experience in older workers, and Cobb, who had the weathered, suspicious skepticism of a man who had seen too many people come and go to get excited about any newcomer, thawed toward Andrew within the first 2 weeks in the slow, deliberate way that genuine respect accumulates. He did not talk much to Beatrice at first. Not because he was cold or distant, but because he seemed to understand that she was a woman in the process of figuring out her own life, and that the most respectful thing he could do was give her the room to do it. He would take his meals in the kitchen. She insisted on that much. She was not going to have a man working on her property eating in a barn, and they would sit across from each other at the table, and he would answer her questions and ask a few of his own, but carefully, always carefully, as though each question were a coin he was spending out of a limited supply. She learned things about him in pieces. He had been born in 1847, in Tennessee, the second of 4 boys in a family that had been destroyed by the war, the way most Southern families were destroyed by the war. Not dramatically, not with the cinematic sweep of a single catastrophic moment, but slowly, through the grinding misery of poverty and displacement and the particular shame of loss. He had come west at 16, which meant 1863, which meant the middle of the war, which meant he had made his escape from a world already on fire and walked into a different kind of fire out on the open plains. He had never married. She asked him that at dinner on a Thursday in late May, directly and without apology, because she had been wondering about it and she had never been the sort of person who let herself wonder indefinitely when she could simply ask. He looked up from his plate. No, any particular reason. He was quiet for a moment. I have not had a life that I thought a woman should be expected to share, he said. Not until recently. And recently, he looked at her. Just looked for a moment, without flinching or looking away. And the quality of that look was something she filed away in the part of her mind that kept careful records of things that mattered. Recently it is different, he said, and turned back to his food. The summer arrived and opened up the Kansas landscape into something almost aggressively beautiful. The sky an impossible blue, the grass rippling in waves under the steady prairie wind, the light so clean and pure in the early morning that Beatrice sometimes stood on the porch with her coffee and felt the particular joy of someone who has been too long indoors and has finally stepped outside. Andrew had proven himself indispensable in ways that went beyond the practical. He had a gift for anticipating problems before they arrived, for seeing the shape of a situation before its full outline had declared itself. When the east section of the roof over the barn began to show signs of weakness, he had it repaired before the summer rains came. When the creek that fed the garden dropped in the July heat and Beatrice had calculated that the vegetables would begin to suffer, he had spent 3 days rerouting from a deeper source she had not known about, consulting with the older homesteaders in the area, and then with a Wichita man who knew the water table in that part of Kansas better than anyone. He also, and she noticed this with a particular warmth, took a thoughtful interest in the things that made the homestead a home rather than just a property. He mended the front gate so that it swung properly, which was a small thing, but one she had been meaning to ask about for months, because the grinding catch of it had bothered her every time she passed through. He replaced the broken second porch step without being asked. When he found that the wood box in the kitchen was consistently low because she was the one cutting and carrying the wood in addition to everything else she was doing, he began cutting enough for a week at a time on Saturday mornings, and he did it without comment or ceremony, as though it were simply an obvious thing that needed doing. She caught herself watching him sometimes. Not with the desperate inventory of loneliness. She was not desperate. She had always been too self-possessed for desperation. But with the genuine interested attention she gave to things she found worth watching. There was something remarkable about the way he moved through the world, this man. Something very deliberate and very honest, as though he had decided long ago that all the alternative approaches had failed, and he was going to try simply being himself and see what happened. In August, Caldwell Flats held its annual summer social, which was in practice a 3-day excuse for the town to gather in the large field behind the church, eat food contributed by every household, and conduct the complex social negotiations that kept a small frontier community functioning. There were foot races for the children, horseshoe contests for the men, dancing on the second evening, and the kind of concentrated gossip that was really just community news transmitted without the softening of formal channels. Beatrice went because she always went, and because she understood that a widow who was seen to be managing was a more socially comfortable proposition than a widow who was struggling, and she had always had the good sense to manage visibly. She was aware that she brought Andrew with her, presenting him to the community as her hired hand with a casual matter-of-factness that she had carefully prepared, would generate a certain amount of interested attention. Caldwell Flats was not a cruel town, but it was a thorough one when it came to observing and discussing the lives of its members. Andrew wore a clean white shirt and his good hat, and he shook hands with people with the easy confidence of a man who is comfortable with himself without being arrogant about it. And he was polite to everyone and funny with the men, once they reached the comfortable stage of a conversation. And Beatrice found herself, on the second evening, watching him talk to old Herman Schultz about cattle pricing, and feeling a warmth in her chest that she recognized and was not quite ready to examine. It was Margaret Tully who said it first, because Margaret Tully always said things first. "He is awfully handsome for a hired hand," Margaret said, appearing at Beatrice's elbow with the particular stealth of a woman who has spent decades positioning herself for optimal commentary. She was 61, round and sharp-eyed, and she meant well in the way that a knife means well, it is useful, it is effective, but you want to know where it is at all times. "He is a good worker," Beatrice said without expression. "He looks at you," Margaret said. Beatrice looked at her. "People look at people, Margaret. Not like that." She nodded toward Andrew, who was at that moment laughing at something Herman said. "He looks at you the way a man looks when he is trying to remember how to want something again after a long time of not allowing himself to." Beatrice was quiet. She picked up her punch glass and took a sip of the warm fruit drink that Mrs. Pierce had provided in abundance. "He knew my husband," she said finally. "I know," Margaret said. She had been 30 years in Caldwell Flats and she knew most things. "That does not mean what you think it means, Beatrice. It does not mean you owe Edmund a certain kind of grief or a certain kind of solitude. Edmund was a good enough man, but you were always more alive than he quite knew what to do with." It was perhaps the most honest thing anyone had said to Beatrice since Edmund's death, and it landed in a complicated way, the way truly honest things tend to land, with a small, sharp pain and then a spreading relief. She did not reply to Margaret directly. But that evening, when the fiddler started up and the dancing began in the warm summer dark lit by lanterns strung between the fence posts, she accepted Andrew's invitation to dance without any of the careful hesitation she had been preparing. He danced well. She had not expected that, and then realized she should have, because Andrew Maddox seemed to do most things well when he put his attention to them. He led with the quiet authority of someone who is not trying to impress, just trying to do the thing correctly, and his hand at her waist was firm and warm, and she was very aware of it. "You are smiling," he said after a moment. "I am allowed to smile." "You are." Something in his voice was careful again, that measured quality she had come to recognize as the sound of a man choosing his words with genuine attention. "I am glad to see it. You look beautiful when you smile." She looked up at him. The lantern light was soft and golden between them, and the fiddle was going, and the Kansas summer night smelled of grass and wood smoke and the sweet particular scent of a community gathered and at ease. "Mr. Maddox," she said. "Andrew," he said. "I think we have known each other long enough for Andrew." "Andrew," she said, and the word felt different from the inside than she had expected. Warmer. "Are you saying that because it is true, or because you think it is what I want to hear?" He considered this with the same seriousness he brought to fence repair and irrigation planning. "Both," he said, "though mostly because it is true." She laughed. She felt the laugh leave her the way something long-held releases, a breath you have been keeping because you were not sure the air outside was safe, and then you open and breathe it and find it is fine. It is more than fine. It is exactly what you needed. They danced twice more that evening. She did not examine what it meant. She had always believed that some things deserved to be felt fully before they were analyzed, and this felt like one of those things. Autumn came to Caldwell Flats the way autumn comes to the Kansas plains, all at once and with extraordinary conviction, the grass turning amber and rust, the sky dropping lower and bluer, the mornings arriving with a bite that the afternoons only partially reversed. The homestead had been prepared. The garden had been harvested and preserved more than Beatrice had ever managed to put up before, because with two people working, what had always seemed like a mountain of labor became manageable. The barn was stocked, the roof was sound, the fence was solid. Beatrice sat on the porch one evening in early October, and Andrew came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her, and she thought that this particular arrangement of 2 people and 2 cups of coffee and the enormous quiet prairie evening was the most naturally comfortable thing she had experienced in years, perhaps ever. "You are thinking," he said. "I think constantly," she said. "It is one of my persistent habits. What about this time?" She held the coffee cup in both hands and watched a hawk turning in wide, slow circles over the far pasture. "About the summer," she said. "About how different things are from what they were in April. Better or worse?" She looked at him sidelong. "You know the answer to that." He did not smile exactly, but something changed in the set of his face, something opened, the way a room opens when you push back the curtains and let the light in. "I would rather hear you say it," he said. "Better," she said. "Considerably better." He was quiet for a moment, and she let the quiet sit, because she had learned that Andrew's silences were working silences. Something was happening in them, and interrupting them was like interrupting a man mid-sentence. "Beatrice," he said finally. He rarely used her first name. She had noticed that he reserved it, like something valuable that should not be spent carelessly. "I want to say something to you, and I need you to know that it does not carry any expectation with it. I am saying it because I believe it to be true and because I think you deserve to hear true things." She waited. "I did not come back here thinking this would happen," he said. "I came back because of a debt, because Edmund had saved me, however accidentally, however partially, and because that meant something to me and I could not leave it unaddressed. I came here to work and to help and to try to make something right that had been wrong for too long." He paused. "But somewhere between April and now, I have discovered that I do not want to think about leaving. And I think that has become about more than the debt." The hawk had disappeared somewhere toward the tree line. The evening was settling around them like a warm cloth. "How much more?" she asked, and her voice was quieter than usual. "Considerably more," he said, using her own word, and there was in his voice a warmth that matched the word, that quiet, private humor of two people who have begun to share a language. She set down her coffee cup. She turned toward him on the porch bench and looked at him in the fading October light, this man who had come to repay a debt and ended up doing something much larger than he had planned. "Andrew," she said, "I am a widow. I have been a widow for 6 months. I am fully aware that there are people in this town who will have opinions about whatever they observe happening between us." "Yes," he said, meeting her gaze. "I am also fully aware," she continued, and there was something steady in her voice that she had not heard from herself before, some particular note of a woman who knows her own mind and is not apologizing for it, "that I am 30 years old next month, and that I have spent the last several years being very careful, and that being careful has its limits." He was looking at her with those dark, honest eyes, not saying anything, just listening. "I like you very much," she said. "I find that surprising and not surprising at the same time, which is an unusual combination. And I think that if you were to, I think I would like it if—" She paused and found to her surprise that she was smiling. "I am usually much more articulate than this." "You are doing fine," he said gently. "I am saying that I would like you to stay," she said. "Not as a hired hand, or not only as a hired hand. I would like you to stay as something that has not been given a name yet, and I would like to give it time to find its name." He reached out and took her hand where it rested on the bench between them. His hand was large and work-roughened and very warm, and he held hers with a careful, wondering gentleness, as though holding something that might be fragile or might be stronger than anything he had ever held, and he was not sure yet which, and wanted to be gentle in the uncertainty. "I am not going anywhere," he said. The months that followed were an unfolding. Not the dramatic unfolding of a story that moves quickly toward its climax, but the slower, warmer unfolding of something that is growing because it has the right conditions and the right care, and is in no hurry to be anything other than exactly what it is. They took walks in the evenings when the work was done, out across the flat prairie land with the enormous Kansas sky going from blue to pink to a profound and serious dark above them. He told her more of his story, the years on the trail, the people he had known, the way a man learns the shape of himself when he is tested by hard work and solitude, and the particular democratic cruelty of the cattle trail, where nobody cared what you had been before, and the only question was whether you could do the work. She told him hers, her mother's house in St. Louis with the green shutters, and the rose garden that her mother had tended with the devotion most people reserve for religion. Her years of schooling, she had been educated beyond what most women of her time and circumstance could expect, because her mother had believed fiercely in the usefulness of a woman's mind and had sacrificed to fund it. Her marriage to Edmund, which she described honestly, neither harshly nor with false sweetness, as a young woman's reasonable choice that had proved to be smaller than she had hoped. "Did you love him?" Andrew asked, one evening in November, and the question was so direct and so carefully asked with genuine curiosity, and not with any ulterior motive she could detect, that she answered it the same way. "I loved the version of him I had constructed," she said. "I am not sure I ever knew the actual person well enough to love him properly. That is partly his fault and partly mine and partly just the nature of things, I suppose. He was a complicated man," Andrew said. "Not bad, but complicated." "Most people are complicated," Beatrice said. "The question is whether they let you see the complication or whether they keep it behind glass." He looked at her. "Which am I?" "You show me things," she said. "Not everything, not all at once, but you show me things. That is a considerable thing, Andrew, more than you may realize." He squeezed her hand where it lay in his on the wooden fence rail they were leaning against, watching the last of the sunset drain from the western horizon. Winter arrived in December with a blizzard that pinned every soul in Caldwell Flats indoors for 3 days, and left the landscape afterward looking like something from a dream, the whole world white and still and brilliant under a sky so blue it seemed artificial. Andrew and Beatrice spent those 3 days in the house, the fire going in the kitchen hearth, and discovered that they were easy company for each other in a way that neither had quite prepared for. She read to him in the evenings. She had a small collection of books, including a volume of poetry by Longfellow that had belonged to her mother, and a worn copy of David Copperfield that she had read so many times the spine had been rebound with leather cord. He listened with genuine attention, and occasionally asked questions about what she was reading that showed he was thinking about it, not just being politely receptive. He, in turn, told her stories. He was a natural storyteller in the oral tradition of men who have spent long evenings around campfires, and his stories were vivid and honest and often funny, and always revealed something about him, and she noticed that he never told a story that cast himself in a better light than he deserved. On the second evening of the blizzard, after supper, she was at the kitchen table working on the household accounts, and he was mending a piece of harness by the fire, and she looked up and found him watching her with that particular quality of attention she had noticed before, present and private and warm, and she thought, "This is what I have been looking for." Not a great romantic declaration, not the dramatic arrival of some feeling she had not expected, but this ordinary evening with its ordinary warmth and its entirely extraordinary comfort. "Andrew," she said. He looked up. "I think you should know that I have been thinking about what happens in the spring." "What happens in the spring?" "When the debt you feel you owe is paid," she said. "When the fences are up and the planting is done and you have done everything you came to do. I want to know what you intend." He set the harness down. He looked at her with those honest dark eyes, and the firelight played along the angles of his face, and she thought, "I am in love with this man." And found that the thought, having arrived, settled comfortably without alarm, as though it had been waiting for her to notice it for some time. "I intend to stay," he said, "if you will have me, not as a hired hand and not out of obligation, but because this," he gestured, a simple encompassing gesture that somehow indicated the kitchen and the fire and the two of them, and the blizzard outside and the whole particular warm world they had constructed together, "is the best thing that has happened to me in a very long time. And I am not a man who walks away from the best thing that has happened to him." She stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen and stood before him, and he rose from the chair, and she put her hands on either side of his face, that work-browned honest face, and kissed him. He kissed her back with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, fully present, fully honest, not performing a feeling but having it, and it was the best kiss of her life, and she had been kissed before, and this was still unambiguously the best. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers for a moment, and she could feel him breathing, and outside the blizzard pressed against the walls of the house, and inside everything was warm. "I should have said something months ago," he said. "You said everything you needed to say," she told him, "in the right order." Winter passed into the muddy optimism of early spring, and things had changed in the way that things change when they are genuinely different rather than just rearranged permanently, and for the better. The town noticed. Of course it did. Caldwell Flats was a small community with sharp eyes and a healthy appetite for narrative, and a widow who had been appropriately somber through the winter was now observed, in the spring markets, and at the Sunday services, and at the well by the town square, to have a color in her face and a particular quality of ease that told the observant everything. Margaret Tully, who missed nothing, simply nodded at Beatrice one Sunday morning, as though something she had predicted had come satisfactorily to pass. Beatrice and Andrew were not secretive. They were private, which is different. They conducted themselves with the dignity appropriate to their circumstances and their community, and they let the observable facts speak for themselves, which was more than enough for a town that was, on balance, fond of both of them. It was in April, exactly 1 year after Edmund's funeral, that Andrew asked her to marry him. He did not make it a spectacle. That was not his way. He waited until a Sunday evening when the spring was fully in the air, warm and full of the smell of new grass and the sound of birds doing their complicated April business in the cottonwoods along the creek, and he took her hand and they walked out to the far pasture where the view of the horizon was unobstructed, and he stopped and turned to her. "I have been thinking about what I said to you in December," he said, "about staying. I want to stay in a way that is permanent, official. I want to marry you, Beatrice, if you will have me. Not because of the debt, and not out of any complicated sense of obligation, but because I love you. And because a life with you is the thing I most want in the world." She looked at him in the April evening light. The prairie stretched out around them in every direction, gold and green and alive, and the sky was enormous and generous above it, and Andrew Maddox stood in the middle of it all looking at her with a love so clear and so present she could feel it like warmth on her skin. "I want to say something to you before I answer," she said. "Of course. When you came here last April," she said slowly, "you came to repay a debt to Edmund, to repay what he had done for you. And you have worked a year here, and you have done more than any man could be expected to do, and if that is what you came to do, you have done it many times over." She paused. "But I want you to hear me when I say that the debt is paid. Whatever Edmund did, whatever you felt you owed, it is settled. Not by me forgiving it, but by you being here and being who you are and doing what you have done. You do not have to stay because of him." He was very still, listening. "I want you to stay because of me," she said, "and because of yourself, and because you love me and I love you, not because of any obligation to a dead man, however much we might have cared for him." She reached up and touched his face. "Is that why you are asking me, because you love me?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "That is exactly why." "Then yes," she said, "I will marry you, Andrew Maddox." He pulled her into his arms and held her with that fierce, careful gentleness that she had come to know was his particular way of holding the things he most valued, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt his heart beating and thought, "This is real." This is entirely real, and it is mine, and I am his, and the world is large and warm, and we have all the time in it. They were married in June of 1879 in the Caldwell Flats church, with Reverend Alcott presiding and Margaret Tully weeping in the front pew with the unabashed emotion of a woman who has been right about something and is enjoying the confirmation. Cobb stood up as Andrew's witness, which Andrew had asked him to do with the straightforward respect that Cobb returned in full measure by wearing his good suit, which had not been out of the cedar chest in 2 years. Beatrice wore a dress of ivory cotton, simply made, which she had sewn herself over the preceding 3 months with a quiet care that she had put into it, knowing that it was going to mean something. She had worn blue at her first wedding because the dress had been blue and she had been practical about it. She wore ivory at her second because she was making a choice, and she wanted the choice to be visible. The ceremony was simple and entirely true. When Andrew said the words of the vow, he said them looking directly at her, not at the Reverend or at his hands or at the middle distance, but at her, and she had the sense that each word was being given to her specifically and deliberately, as though he had chosen every one. When he kissed her, there was a sound from the assembled townspeople, not quite a cheer, more the involuntary murmur of a community observing something genuinely good. And Margaret Tully wept more energetically, and Cobb made a sound in his throat that was, for Cobb, the equivalent of a standing ovation. The reception was held in the field behind the church, which was where everything important in Caldwell Flats happened, and there was food and dancing, and the fiddle and the warm June evening going golden around them, and Beatrice danced with her husband and thought she might be the happiest she had ever been. The summer of 1879 settled around the homestead like something rightfully belonging there. Andrew and Beatrice worked together with the easy competence of two people who have learned each other's rhythms, and found that the rhythms are compatible, not identical, not forced into the same pattern, but genuinely complementary in the way that good things are when they have been properly matched. The homestead expanded. Andrew's savings from the Texas cattle operation, which he had been careful with, were enough to purchase the adjacent 40 acres that had been sitting unclaimed since its previous owner had given up on Kansas and headed north. They fenced it and planted a portion of it with wheat, which was becoming the future of the Kansas plains as the cattle era began its slow transition. The rest they kept as grazing land and began, carefully and not overambitiously, building a small herd of their own. Caldwell Flats was itself changing. The railroad had arrived 2 years before, and with it the kind of commerce that transforms a cattle town from a rough transit point into something with more permanent aspirations. New buildings were going up along the main street. The school had been expanded. There was talk of a proper hospital to replace the room behind the barber's that had served as a medical facility in emergencies. Andrew became, over the following months, a respected member of the community, not through deliberate effort, but through the natural accumulation of good character applied consistently. He helped his neighbors when they needed it without making it a ceremony. He was fair in his business dealings to a degree that earned the trust of men who had been burned by unfairness before and were not inclined to extend it easily. He served on the committee formed to negotiate the terms of the new land acquisition west of town, and did it with the same straightforward honesty he brought to everything. Beatrice continued her work, the garden, the preserves, the accounts, which she handled with a precision that Andrew admired and eventually simply handed over to her in full, saying that she was better at it than he was, and he would rather do the work of earning the money than the work of organizing it. She also began, in the fall of 1879, to teach. The expanded school needed a second teacher, and Beatrice, whose education had always been one of the truest things about her, stepped into the role with a sense of rightness that she had not felt about anything for a very long time. She loved teaching with the same quality of attention she had given to everything. She genuinely valued fully present, genuinely invested, not performing the role but inhabiting it. The children responded to her the way children respond to adults who take them seriously, with a trust and engagement that was both gratifying and humbling. And then, in the spring of 1880, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Andrew on a morning in March before breakfast, when the light was still new and the kitchen was warm from the fire she had started, and she sat across from him at the table where they had sat so many times before, and she watched his face as she said the words, wanting to see the exact quality of what he felt. What she saw undid her a little. He went very still, the way he went still when something was landing in him too large to respond to immediately, and then something changed and his face opened, the way that face had opened and opened for her over the past 2 years, each time revealing something new and true, and his eyes were bright and he reached across the table and took both her hands. "Beatrice," he said. And then he could not say anything more for a moment, which was fine, because she could see everything in his face that needed saying. The pregnancy was uncomplicated. She was strong and healthy and practical about it, continuing her teaching until the summer and managing the household affairs with her usual efficiency, with Andrew supplementing everything she could not do with a quiet, devoted attention that never felt like managing her but always like caring for her, which is a distinction she appreciated enormously. In October of 1880, their son was born. They named him Thomas Edmund Maddox Thomas for Andrew's father, Edmund for Beatrice's first husband, because she thought it was the right thing to do, because Edmund had been part of her life and part of the chain of events that had brought her to Andrew, and because Andrew, when she suggested it, had been quiet for a moment and then said yes, because it was generous and true, and those were values they were both trying to build their life around. Thomas Edmund Maddox arrived healthy and loud, and with a full head of dark hair that was clearly his father's contribution, and he was placed in Beatrice's arms, and she looked at him and felt the specific, enormous, ordinary miracle of a new person arriving in the world and belonging to you. Andrew held his son with the same careful, wondering quality with which he had first held Beatrice's hand on the porch bench in that October evening 3 years before, as though holding something that might be fragile or might be the strongest thing he had ever held, and he was not sure which, and the uncertainty required gentleness. He looked at Beatrice over the baby's head, and the expression on his face was something she did not have words for, and she thought that was all right, because some things do not need words, they just need to be witnessed. Thomas was a happy, curious child. He had his mother's sharp eyes and his father's steady temperament, and a laugh that could be heard across 2 rooms, and he brought to the homestead a new kind of life that was louder and more chaotic and considerably better than what had come before. The years passed in the way that good years pass richly, and with the sense of time being well spent rather than endured. Andrew and Beatrice built what they had intended, a working homestead, a real home, a life that had the solidity and warmth of something built on genuine foundations. It was in the spring of 1883 that the past returned, which is the way the past tends to return, when you have settled into something good enough to make a threat to it feel real. A man named Hollis came through Caldwell Flats on his way to somewhere else. He was the kind of man who was always on his way somewhere else, because men like Hollis are never comfortable enough in one place to stay. He had known Andrew in the years before Kansas, in the years of the cattle work that had not always been legitimate, and he had a memory like a ledger and a disposition that was inclined to see opportunity in other people's vulnerabilities. He came to the homestead on a Tuesday afternoon, riding a horse that looked as tired of him as any observer might be, and he stood at the gate and called out, and Andrew came from the barn with his arms folded, and the particular stillness of a man who has been expecting something and is glad it has finally arrived so he can deal with it. Beatrice was on the porch. She watched. She had always known the rough outline of Andrew's past. He had not hidden it from her. That would have violated something fundamental in the way they had built their life. She knew the years before Kansas, and she knew they were not spotless, and she had made her peace with it because she understood that a man is not solely the sum of what he did when he was young and poor and foolish, but the sum of what he did with all the years after. Holly spoke to Andrew for perhaps 10 minutes. She could not hear most of it, but she could read the body language clearly enough. Holly's with the particular posture of a man making a demand he is trying to dress up as a request, and Andrew with the settled, immovable quality of a man who has decided what his answer is and is not moved by the framing. When Holly's finished, Andrew said something short and clear. Holly said something more. Andrew said something else and pointed at the road, and the gesture was so unambiguous that Holly's looked at it for a moment as though checking whether he had misread it, and then he got back on his tired horse and rode away. Andrew came back to the porch. He sat down beside her. "Are you going to tell me?" she said. "Yes," he said, "all of it." And he did. He told her the parts he had not told her before, not because he had been hiding them, but because they had not seemed necessary to tell until now. There were 2 or 3 episodes in his 20s, in the years before the work with Edmund's crew, that were worse than what she had known. Nothing violent. He was emphatic about that, and she believed him, because she had come to know him well enough to understand the shape of what he was and was not capable of but things that were dishonest, and that he was genuinely ashamed of. Holly's had wanted money in exchange for his silence about those episodes. He had calculated, incorrectly, that Andrew Maddox with a wife and a son and a homestead and a good reputation in Caldwell Flats would pay a considerable sum to protect those things. "What did you say to him?" Beatrice asked. "I told him that I did not pay for the past," Andrew said. "That if he wanted to tell the sheriff what he knew, he could go ahead and tell it, and I would tell it first myself, and the sheriff would hear it from my mouth with my full account of everything I have done since, and then the community could decide what to make of it. And then I told him to get off my property." She looked at him. "Would you have told the sheriff yourself?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "I was not bluffing. I should have done it years ago. The only reason I did not was that I was afraid of what it would cost us. And now I think the cost of not doing it is higher." He looked at her steadily. "I am sorry. I should have Andrew." She took his hand. "Stop apologizing for being human. Beatrice, I am serious." She held his hand and looked at him with the directness she had always brought to the things that mattered. "Do you think I do not know who you are? Do you think 3 years of marriage and a child, and all the days between April of 1878 and this one have not told me everything I need to know about the substance of you?" She paused. "You are the most honest man I have ever known. That does not mean you were always honest. It means you chose honesty as the way to live, and you chose it when you did not have to, and you chose it even when it cost you things." He was quiet, looking at her. "Go and tell Sheriff Harlan what you need to tell him," she said. "Go today before Holly's gets there first, and then come home." He went that afternoon. He was home by supper. Sheriff Harlan, who was a practical man with a practical philosophy of justice, and a clear-eyed understanding of the difference between who a man was at 20 and who he was at 36, listened to Andrew's full account with the careful attention of someone who is deciding something real. He asked questions. Andrew answered them honestly. At the end of it, Harlan was quiet for a moment, and then he said that as far as he could determine, none of what Andrew had described constituted anything that fell under current jurisdiction, that the relevant events had occurred in other counties and other states and were more than a decade past, and that a man's character was perhaps best judged by the totality of his record rather than its most unflattering chapters. He also mentioned, with a dryness that was his form of warmth, that Andrew Maddox had a better reputation in Caldwell Flats than half the men who had been born there, which was worth something. Holly's pass through Caldwell Flats 2 days later evidently found that his leverage had evaporated and continued on his way to wherever he was going and was never heard from again. The homestead exhaled, or perhaps Beatrice and Andrew exhaled, which amounted to the same thing. life continued in its good and ordinary way. Thomas grew into a boy who was endlessly curious about every working thing on the homestead, and shadowed his father from the moment he could walk with any reliability, asking questions in the patient, methodical way that suggested he had inherited his mother's determination to understand things thoroughly. Andrew answered every question with the same patient thoroughness, because he believed that a child's curiosity was one of the best things in the world and deserved respect. Beatrice continued teaching. She had become, by 1883, one of the most respected voices in Caldwell Flats on the subject of the school, its curriculum, its funding, its expansion. She had opinions about what children needed to learn and how they needed to learn it, and she expressed those opinions with the clarity and evidence that made them difficult to dismiss, which was occasionally inconvenient for the school board but ultimately good for the children, which was the point. In the summer of 1883, she was invited to attend a territorial conference on public education in Wichita, which was 3 days by rail from Caldwell Flats. She went because she was the right person to go, and because Andrew told her to go and promised that he, Cobb, and Thomas would manage perfectly well for 3 days, which they did, though when she returned the kitchen was in a state that suggested the management had been energetic if not entirely organized. She brought Andrew a book from a Wichita bookseller, a volume on practical irrigation techniques that she had noticed in the window and known immediately he would want. She brought Thomas a carved wooden horse that made him incandescent with delight. She brought herself home, which was, as she reflected on the platform watching Andrew walk toward her across the Caldwell Flats station with Thomas on his shoulders, and a smile she could feel from 50 yards, the best of all the things she was carrying. The second pregnancy arrived in 1884. They had hoped for it, and when it came she felt the same warmth as before, mixed with the practical second-time confidence of someone who had done this once and knew what she was doing. The birth, in February of 1885, gave them a daughter. They named her Clara Jean Maddox, Clara for Beatrice's mother, and Jean because Andrew said it was a good strong name, and he had known a woman in his cattle-driving days named Jean, who was the most capable and formidable person he had encountered, which he meant as the highest compliment. Clara arrived in the world with the same dark hair as her brother but her mother's gray eyes, and she was quieter than Thomas at the same age, more watchful, taking everything in with the steady, observant attention of someone doing serious assessment. Andrew held her the way he had held Thomas, and then looked at Beatrice and smiled the same slow, wide smile, and she thought, "There it is. There is the best thing in the world again, and still." Thomas adored his sister with the wholehearted, sometimes overwhelming devotion of a 5-year-old who has discovered that he is capable of love in a new direction. He brought her things she could not yet use and explained to her, at length, the workings of the homestead and the barn and the horses, and Beatrice watched this from the kitchen window and felt the particular profound happiness of a woman whose life has exceeded what she once, in her worst and most private moments, feared might be possible. The years between 1885 and the turn of the decade were the years of building, not frantically, not with the desperate urgency of people who fear what they have, but with the steady, confident investment of people who know what they are building toward and trust the process. The Maddox homestead became a proper ranch. The wheat did well in the expanding Kansas agricultural economy, and the cattle herd grew to a size that made the operation genuinely profitable. Andrew hired 2 additional hands beyond Cobb, men who proved to be reliable, and who were treated with the same fairness that Andrew had always brought to his relationships with workers, because he remembered being a working man with no advantages, and he had decided that remembering it was important. Cobb stayed. Cobb was approaching 70, and his knees were worse than ever, and he refused to slow down about it, which Andrew and Beatrice both admired and worried about in equal measure. They had, over the years, expanded his compensation, and his role in ways that respected his experience while acknowledging his limitations. And Cobb had accepted this with the dignity of a man who understands that being cared for properly is not the same as being diminished. One evening in 1887, when Thomas was 7 and Clara was 2, and the evening was the particular gold of a late Kansas summer, Beatrice and Andrew sat on the porch after the children had been put to bed, and she thought about how rarely she sat here now without something pressing, and how good it was to sit with nothing pressing and nowhere to be, and nothing required of her except to be here. "I want to tell you something," she said. He set down his coffee cup. "Tell me, do you remember what you said to me when you came back about repaying a debt?" "Of course," he said. He would always remember that conversation, she knew. It had been too important to either of them to fade. "And do you feel that you have," she said, "repaid it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I came here to repay what Edmund did," he said, "what I felt I owed." And then he smiled, and it was the smile she had come to love most, the one that arrived slowly and with its full self. And then things changed, and what I was doing stopped being repayment and became something else entirely. "I know," she said, "but I want to say this properly so that you hear it." She turned to face him on the bench, the same bench where so much of their early history had been made. "You came here with a debt, and I want you to know that the debt was paid. I do not mean by the work you did on the fence or the garden or the barn, though all of that mattered. I mean that the debt was paid the moment you chose to come back at all, the moment you sat on my porch and told me the truth. That was Andrew. Most men would not have done that. Most men would have stayed away and called it even and gotten on with their lives. I could not have gotten on with my life," he said simply. "It did not feel right." "No," she said. "And that is exactly what I mean. You repaid everything you owed the moment you chose to be the kind of man who comes back." She paused. "Everything after was just everything after was us, our life. That was not debt repayment, that was love." He was looking at her in the fading summer light, and she could see him receiving this, receiving it the way he received the things she gave him, with full attention and without deflection. "You told me something once," she said. "Before we were married in December during the blizzard. You said that this," she made the same encompassing gesture he had made that night, "was the best thing that had happened to you in a very long time." "I remember. I want to tell you," she said, her voice soft and steady and sure, "that you are the best thing that has ever happened to me. Not despite how it started, not in spite of the complicated history and the debt and Edmund and all of it. Because of all of it. Because everything that happened brought you to my porch, and everything since has been the most real and most good that my life has ever been." He was quiet for a long moment. The prairie evening settled around them. The cottonwoods along the creek rustled in the warm wind. Far away, an owl began to call. "Beatrice," he said finally, and her name in his mouth was always still the best sound. "I love you. That is all I want to say. Everything else you have said is more articulate than anything I could manage. I just love you, and I am grateful every day." "I know," she said and took his hand. "I know you do, and I you." They sat together on the porch as the last light left the Kansas sky and the stars came out enormous out here, away from the gas lamps of any city, enormous and generous and bright. And the homestead was quiet around them, the children asleep, the ranch hands long since done with their day, the horses quiet in the barn, everything at rest. This was the life they had built. This was what had come from a debt and a graveside, and a stranger on a ridge who had held his hat in his hand, as a sign of respect for a man he had complicated feelings about. This was what came from a woman who had looked at that stranger and seen something real, and let it be real rather than keeping it behind glass. In 1889, Kansas became the 34th state to be admitted to the Union, which meant that Caldwell Flats found itself no longer on the frontier in quite the legal and administrative sense it once had been. The territory that had made the West wild was being organized into something more settled, more structured, more like the East that so many of its inhabitants had left behind. This was a good thing in most respects. It meant law and infrastructure and the kind of permanence that protects families. But it also meant the end of something, the close of the particular era that had shaped the people who had lived through it. Andrew marked it with the seriousness it deserved, because he had been part of that era, had ridden across it, worked within it, been shaped by its rough and democratic justice, and he felt its passing as both a loss and a relief. The West of his youth had been real and vital, and it had also been brutal, and the brutality had fallen most heavily on those with the least power to resist it. The native peoples whose land had been taken with a thoroughness that was still only beginning to be reckoned with. The black cowboys who had ridden the same trails and received a fraction of the recognition. The Chinese laborers who had laid the railroad lines under impossible conditions and been repaid with legislation that stripped them of basic rights. Andrew had seen these things, and he was not inclined to romanticize the era that had produced them, even as he acknowledged what it had meant in his own history. He talked about these things with Beatrice, who had her own views, which were sharp and clear and frequently expressed in her classroom to children who were growing up in a state that was still deciding what kind of place it wanted to be. Thomas, at 9, understood that the world was not entirely fair, because his parents had been honest with him about this, and he was the kind of child who asked what could be done about it, which Beatrice considered the most promising possible response. Clara, at 4, was primarily concerned with the horses and the garden and whether Thomas would play with her after supper, which was also a reasonable set of priorities. Life organized itself around work and love and the changing rhythms of a growing family. The homestead thrived. Cobb, at 72, finally accepted the lighter duties that his body had been requesting for years, and Andrew built him a small, comfortable house on the property and told him it was his for as long as he wanted it, which Cobb accepted by turning away and spending several minutes attending to something in the barn that apparently required great concentration and produced a suspicious amount of blinking. In 1890, Beatrice turned 41, which she observed with the equanimity of a woman who has found that each year adds more than it takes. Andrew turned 43. They were, by the standards of the time and the place, people of established middle age, which meant they were considered reliable and substantial, and which meant absolutely nothing to either of them in private, where he still looked at her across the kitchen table with that particular quality of attention that had not dimmed in 12 years of marriage. And she still felt, when he came in from the day's work and put his hat on the hook by the door, the particular warm settling of a woman whose world has its right anchor. A third child came as something they had not expected but welcomed with open hearts. Beatrice was 42, which in 1891 was considered late for a first child and simply late for a third, but she was healthy and strong and practical, and she refused to treat it as anything other than what it was, which was good news of the most fundamental kind. The birth, in the spring of 1892, gave them another son. They named him William James Maddox William for no one in particular, but because it was a good solid name that suited the child's substantial, determined arrival in the world, and James for Cobb, whose first name turned out, after 11 years of first-name-less acquaintance, to be James, a fact that Cobb received with visible embarrassed pleasure when informed that the baby was to carry it. William James arrived with his father's dark eyes and his mother's mouth, and a set of lungs that made his older siblings retreat to the far corners of the house in the first weeks and gradually return, as he settled into the world and found it satisfactory. Thomas, at 12, was old enough to be genuinely helpful and genuinely interested, and he took to his new brother with the careful seriousness of a boy who understands that a baby is a real person and treats him accordingly. Clara, at 7, appointed herself an assistant of primary importance and performed this role with magnificent self-importance and genuine effectiveness. Andrew held his third child in the same way he had held the first and the second, that careful, wondering tenderness that had never become routine and looked at Beatrice over the baby's head, and she saw in his face the same thing she always saw: love that was so present and so genuine it did not need to perform itself. "3," she said. "3," he agreed, and smiled. The family that the homestead had become was not a quiet one. Meals were loud with the particular productive chaos of children at different ages with different opinions, and the constant traffic of ideas between them. The kitchen table that had seen so many important conversations between two people now saw a more complicated kind of conversation, the kind that happens when a family is thinking out loud together. Andrew was a good father in the way that a person is good at something they love, not perfectly, not without error, but with genuine care and genuine attention, and the willingness to learn from his mistakes rather than defend them. He had not had an example of this kind of fatherhood in his own history, and he had built it from scratch out of what seemed right and true, which was perhaps the best foundation for anything. Beatrice was a formidable mother, which she had suspected she would be. She loved her children with a fierce, clear-eyed love that included honoring who they were rather than who she had imagined they would be. And she applied to motherhood the same practical intelligence she applied to everything, thoughtfully, without sentimentality, and with deep warmth beneath the clarity. The school in Caldwell Flats by 1893 was, by the standards of a Kansas frontier town, an excellent one. Beatrice had worked toward this for 15 years, and the results were visible in the children who came through it. She was proud of it in the way she was proud of most things she had helped build, not boastfully, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has done real work and can see the evidence of it. In the spring of 1894, something happened that closed a circle so completely, and so simply that Beatrice was moved to tears by it, which was not her usual response to things but seemed, in this instance, appropriate. She was in the kitchen with 10-year-old Thomas one afternoon when he asked her something that had apparently been settling in him for a while. He was at the age when children begin to understand that the world has a history and that their parents are part of it, and he had pieced together, from years of overheard conversations and the kind of careful listening that sharp children do, a rough outline of the story that had brought his parents together. "Was it hard?" he asked. Before Father came, she set down the bowl she was holding and looked at her son. He had his father's eyes and his mother's directness, and he was looking at her with the genuine, non-deflectable curiosity of someone who wants the actual answer. "Yes," she said, "it was hard. I was alone and the place needed a great deal of work and I was not sure how things would be. And then Father came. And then your father came," she said. Thomas was quiet for a moment, working something through. "Did you know right away," he asked, "that things would be all right?" She thought about Andrew on her porch with his hat in his hands and his dark, honest eyes and the weight he had been carrying. She thought about that first cup of coffee across the table and the story that had not been quite what she expected. She thought about April turning into summer, turning into fall, turning into the particular October evening on the porch where everything had shifted. "No," she said honestly, "I did not know right away, but I knew fairly quickly that your father was someone worth knowing, and the more I knew him, the more certain I became." Thomas nodded. This seemed to satisfy him in the way that honest answers satisfy serious children. "He talks about you," he said, with the mild wonder of a child reporting something that has struck him as notable. "When he is working and you are not there, he talks about you like you are part of what he is thinking about all the time." Beatrice looked at her son and felt the tears arrive, not unhappy tears, nothing like that, but the tears of a woman who has received something beautiful and is not ashamed of being moved by it. "That is the kindest thing I have ever heard," she said. She went out to the barn that afternoon. Andrew was there with William, who at 2 was already determined to be wherever his father was, perched on a hay bale watching Andrew work on a piece of tack with the earnest concentration of someone who is planning to be extremely helpful the moment an opportunity presents itself. She stood in the barn doorway and watched them for a moment, her husband and her youngest child. the light falling through the gaps in the boards in long golden slants, the smell of hay and horses, and the good warm smell of the barn that had meant safety and work, and honest life for as long as she had been on this land. Andrew looked up and saw her. That slow smile again, the one that had not changed in 16 years, since the summer of 1878 when it had first appeared across a kitchen table over 2 cups of coffee. "Everything all right," he said. "Everything is wonderful," she said. "I just wanted to look at you." He held her gaze for a moment, that look of full presence, and then he said, "I will be in for supper in an hour," and she nodded and turned to go, and he said, quietly enough that she almost missed it, "Beatrice." She turned back. "I love you," he said. "That's all." She smiled. "I know," she said. "I love you too, that's all." She walked back to the house through the late afternoon gold of the Kansas spring, and the cottonwoods were budding, and the garden was coming up green, and the fence was solid along its whole length, and the house was full of the sounds of her children, and the life that had started with a debt and a graveside and a stranger on a ridge was so completely and entirely hers that she could not remember any more what it had felt like before it existed, and she found she did not need to remember. The present was sufficient, more than sufficient. It was everything. The years continued to prove this. By the turn of the century, the Maddox homestead had become the Maddox Ranch in full, the kind of established, well-run operation that neighbors pointed to as an example of what could be built when intelligence and hard work and genuine partnership were applied to a piece of land. Thomas, at 19, was doing the work of a full adult hand and learning the business from his father with the methodical seriousness that suggested he would one day run it with the same quality of care. Clara, at 14, was her mother's most devoted student and her father's most insightful critic, in the way that daughters can be with fathers they deeply admire. William, at 8, had graduated from observation to active participation and was loudly certain that he already knew more about horses than anyone on the property, an assessment that the horses themselves appeared to accept without objection. Cobb died in 1899, at 79, in the house on the property that had been his for 12 years. He died in his sleep, on a winter morning, which was the death of a man who had worked hard and honestly and had nothing to keep him from rest. Andrew sat with him at the grave in the Caldwell Flats cemetery, a different corner of it from where Edmund lay, the better part of it, and said quiet things, and Beatrice stood beside him with her hand in his, and understood that grief for a good person is an act of love, and allowed it its full expression. Margaret Tully died in 1901, which was a loss felt by the whole town, because Margaret Tully had been the connective tissue of Caldwell Flats for 40 years, and there was no replacing the knowledge she had carried, or the sharp-tongued warmth that had always, beneath its sharpness, been genuine. Beatrice wrote in the letter she sent to Margaret's daughter in Topeka that Margaret had been the most useful kind of friend, the kind who tells you the truth when you most need it and least want it, and she had been right about everything that mattered, and the town was considerably diminished by her absence. The school went on. Beatrice was 51 years old and still teaching, and she had no intention of stopping until either her mind or her body demanded it, neither of which showed any sign of doing so. She had trained 2 younger teachers in the years since, and worked alongside them with the easy authority of someone who does not need to perform their expertise because it is simply evident. In 1903, Thomas brought home a young woman named Eliza Rand, the daughter of a wheat farming family from the neighboring county, who had her own opinions about everything and held them with the same clarity that Beatrice had always admired in people, and who looked at Thomas with exactly the kind of look that told Beatrice everything she needed to know about the situation. She took Eliza into the kitchen for coffee and conversation with the same straightforward welcome she offered to everything she intended to make part of her life, and Eliza, who had apparently heard enough about the formidable Beatrice Maddox to approach the meeting with some trepidation, visibly relaxed in the first 10 minutes and was talking openly, and with genuine animation by the end of the first cup. Andrew watched this from the doorway with his arms folded, and the particular private smile of a man who is not surprised by anything his wife does and is consistently grateful for all of it. Thomas and Eliza were married in the fall of 1903 in the same Caldwell Flats church where Andrew and Beatrice had been married 24 years before. Reverend Alcott's successor, a younger man named Bridges, conducted the ceremony. Beatrice sat in the pew and watched her son speak his vows to the woman he loved, and she felt, beside the warmth and joy of it, a particular resonance, the echo of her own wedding day, and behind it the echo of all the days that had followed, and beyond that the awareness that love, when it is real and is cared for, is a thing that perpetuates itself through generations and keeps building what it touches. Andrew found her hand in the pew and held it without saying anything, because he was thinking the same thing, and they had been together long enough to know when the same thought was in both of them. By 1905, they were grandparents. Thomas and Eliza's first child was a boy they named Andrew James Maddox, which had been Eliza's idea, and which caused the elder Andrew Maddox to go temporarily quiet, and then clear his throat and excuse himself to the barn for a few minutes, because some feelings are large enough to require privacy. Clara, at 20, was studying to be a teacher herself, having inherited her mother's conviction about the value of it and her own additional conviction that the curriculum available to girls was inadequate, and she intended to do something about it, a position she argued with the precision and passion that made her parents simultaneously proud and slightly exhausted on the occasions when she argued it at the dinner table. William, at 15, was becoming the horseman he had always announced he would be, with a gift for working with difficult animals that seemed almost intuitive, a patience and a wordless communication that made experienced horsemen stop and watch when he worked. Beatrice and Andrew, in the evenings of 1905, sat on the porch of the house they had rebuilt and expanded 3 times over the years, but that still contained, in its bones, the original structure that Edmund had built and Andrew had repaired, sat with their coffee, and watched the Kansas evening do its eternal and endlessly various performance with the sky, and talked about their children and their grandchild and the ranch and the school and the world, which was changing in ways both hopeful and alarming as the new century found its footing. "We have had a good life," Andrew said one evening. It was not a complicated statement. It was a summary. "We have had an extraordinary life," Beatrice said. She meant it with the precision she brought to language. Not merely good, extraordinary. He turned to look at her. He was 58 years old and she was 56, and both of them carried the marks of the years in ways that the years mark those who work and love and live. The lines around his eyes were deeper, and her hair had gone to silver, and neither of these things diminished anything that had been there before. He looked at her the same way he had looked at her across the kitchen table in 1878, when they had first sat together with their coffee and their complicated history and their unknowing future, and the quality of the look was unchanged, present, honest, full of a warmth that had only accumulated and never depleted. "I think about it sometimes," he said, "coming here, sitting on your porch, not knowing what I was walking into." "What did you think you were doing?" she asked. "When you came?" "Discharging an obligation," he said, "making something right that had been wrong." He paused, "finding out that those are not the only things possible when you choose to do the right thing." She smiled. "You found out considerably more than that." "I found out everything that mattered," he said simply, and she heard in it the whole scope of what it contained: Thomas and Clara and William and Andrew James, and the grandchild's grandchildren they would never see but could already imagine. The school and the ranch and the neighbors and the years of good work and good love. The prairie and the sky and the ordinary extraordinary weight of a life that had been lived fully and honestly and together. She reached across and took his hand. "Andrew," she said, "yes, you came back to repay a debt." She said it the way you say something when you are summarizing something you have been thinking about for a long time, And you did everything you intended to do and more. And somewhere along the way I would like to think I said this to you properly, but in case I did not, she looked at him, and her voice was steady and her eyes were clear. The debt was paid the moment you came back. Everything after was already yours. Everything after was already ours. He looked at her for a long moment. The sun was doing something magnificent with the horizon, that final moment before dark where the light gathered itself for one last brilliant statement, and the prairie received it the way the prairie receives everything, with enormous patient openness. "I know," he said. He brought her hand to his lips and held it there for a moment. "You told me once, a long time ago. You said the debt was paid, and I thought I understood you then." He paused. "I understand you better now." "You always did," she said. "Understand things better over time. It is one of your best qualities." He laughed. The good laugh, the real one, low and genuine and full. The laugh that had been one of the first things she had loved about him, though she had not known she was loving it yet. "I learned from a very good teacher," he said. The evening settled around them, as the Kansas evenings had settled around them for 27 years of marriage and the year before it, as they would continue to settle around them for whatever years the world chose to give. And the porch held them as it had always held them, and the house behind them held everything they had built. And out beyond the fence line the prairie went on in every direction toward the horizon that was always in Kansas, further than you thought it was. And always more beautiful than you expected, and never quite the same twice. Beatrice Grayson Maddox sat with her husband's hand in hers and watched the last light leave the western sky and thought, "This is what a life is. This is what it is when you let someone in, when you let the real thing be real instead of keeping it behind glass. When you take a man who comes with a debt and a complicated past, and you see past those things to the person underneath, or rather, you see that those things are part of the person, and you love the whole of it, all of it. The complicated history and the hard-won honesty, and the patient love and the work, and the years and the children, and the ordinary miraculous dailiness of a life built together on flat Kansas ground under an enormous Kansas sky. She would not trade a single year of it. Not the hard ones, and certainly not the good ones. All of it had been necessary. All of it had been theirs. And there was still, she thought, looking at the first stars beginning to appear in the deep blue vault of the evening above the prairie, more of it to come. There always was, when you had chosen well, and they had chosen very well indeed.